This is the beginning of, I'm going to call this the beginning of lecture 2. I know that lecture 1 got split up into several PowerPoints because nobody wants to listen to a 3-hour PowerPoint. I know I definitely don't. I don't even like doing a 3-hour lecture when I have a class to talk to, let alone sitting at home by yourself. So I'll probably split this one up too, but this is technically topic 2, soil organisms. If you were in the class with me right now, I'd probably ask you what these critters are, because for those of you who have been on a winter walk with me before, I've probably pointed them out. They're one of my favorite soil critters. In Ontario, in the winter, they're quite common on warm winter days. They crawl out of the soil and they sit on the top of the snow and they jump around. They're springtails. I have a whole slide about them later, but I just wanted to talk about them because I love them. So we're starting with organisms. Remember that soil is made up of 4 components: air, water, organisms, and lithosphere rocks. And we'll talk about all of those at different times. Because this is a fall term and winter is coming, we start with organisms so that we can get out there and we can look for them before it gets too cold. So in that case, because we're looking at organisms, soil is an ecosystem. Within that soil, you're going to see all the parts of an ecosystem. You're going to be seeing plants and animals and fungi. We're going to be seeing even bacteria and archaea. And they have all those different roles that you're used to seeing in food webs, right? Herbivores, detrivores, predators, they're all there. It gets a little confusing because in a traditional food web, you've got your autotrophs, which are your plants that are creating their own energy. And then you have your heterotrophs, and we usually talk of them as herbivores, things that eat plants, and then carnivores or predators, things that are eating those herbivores. But in a soil setting, it gets to be a little bit more complicated than that. So that brings us to our food webs. So your typical food web that you learned in first year environmental science that you might have brought with you from high school, you start with producers. So I'm going to start with solar energy because that's where the producers are getting their energy from. And then consumers are eating those producers, and eventually detrivores are going to break down those consumers. So we can look at this as another way. We can think that the solar energy is going into the producers, and then herbivores are eating the producers, carnivores are eating the herbivores, and you sometimes have multiple layers of that before you hit the detrivores. In the soil food web, producers are more rare. Instead of true producers, you have the decaying organic matter that they produce. So the leaf litter or their poop, that is sort of the source of that solar energy, the beginning of our soil food web. The primary consumers, or your herbivores, are actually our detrivores that are breaking apart that organic matter. Our secondary consumers are kind of like our tiny carnivores, the things that are eating the detrivores. And this keeps going. We have tertiary consumers that are eating the secondary consumers, and eventually you keep going until you get large enough organisms that things outside of the soil are eating them. So I'm going to show you what this looks like with some pictures. Everyone likes pictures. So here's an example. We've got the solar energy being taken in by those plants, and that organic matter is being left behind. The leaves senesce from grasses and from trees, and that's a lot of the producers of the organic matter. And then our primary consumers are eating that basic organic matter. And that can be fungi, that can be earthworms, that can be bacteria. It doesn't matter how big or small they are, they're still primary consumers, and things are going to eat those. So then we have a layer of critters that are consuming those primary consumers. So this is kind of like the herbivore carnivore layer. And then those secondary consumers that are eating the detrivores are then being eaten by, let's call them top carnivores, but often they're called higher level consumers. So they're usually eating other mobile animal-like critters. Another way to look at this, where we have our photosynthesizers, right, our producers, and then we have our first layer of consumers that are eating that our organic matter. And then we have our secondary consumers that are eating those detrivores, and then our like top carnivores. But they're not always top carnivores because there's frequently bigger things eating them. So whereas I consider a centipede to be a fairly top carnivore in the soil ecosystem, there are bigger things like predatory insectivores like shrews and moles and birds and even salamanders that are eating those higher carnivores. And then typically beyond that, we don't consider it part of the soil ecosystem because those critters are usually eaten by things that aren't living in the soil. So things that are eating shrews are usually things like foxes and snakes. And we don't always include them as part of the soil ecosystem. Even though they are pooping to help create soil, they are adding to that soil ecosystem. I like this particular diagram because it also shows like above ground as well as below ground, giving you an idea that they are interconnected. So those ecosystems, sometimes we talk about ecosystem engineers. So the soil is dynamic. It's getting changed by those organisms that are living in it. And when we talk about ecosystem engineers, like realistically, a tree is an ecosystem engineer. It is totally changing the soil chemistry. It's creating soils, its roots break up. But when we talk about ecosystem engineers, we're usually talking about more specific changes, like a beaver creating a pond. That's an ecosystem engineer. So we're more specifically looking at things like burrowers, the animals that are making their home in the soil. They're engineering the ecosystem that they're living in. So ants and termites are super famous for this. Worms are a classic example, but even larger organisms like salamanders or shrews and moles are digging their own holes in that earth. The other thing that we like to talk about in ecosystem engineering are cachers. So dung beetles are literally moving detrivore around from one place to another, adding poop in large amounts to specific places. Wasps will bury larvae and the food for that larva underground. Mice are great cachers, chipmunks are great cachers. Termites and ants build entire mounds of caches underground, grow huge fungal farms underground. And then last, a little bit harder to understand, are the chemists. So these are fungi and bacteria that can actually change how the soil functions. So they can change the pH around an area, or they can even change the water retention of the soil to make it more inhospitable to other organisms. They're creating an environment that they prefer and making it harder for their competitors to live there. Right. Oh, and I didn't talk about the pictures. There's a dung beetle at the bottom, and at the top is a ring of funguses, and that fungus is changing the pH of the soil where it's living. So I'm going to go through all the different critters. I use the term critter a lot because animal is not really accurate for some of these, but I'm going to start using the terms fauna and flora. So the soil fauna are what we typically call animals. So this is going to include all of the actual animals, but it's also going to include protists, which some people think of it as animals and some people don't really think of animals. But all those moving critters, I'm going to call those fauna. And then flora is going to include the plants. When we talk about flora, we talk about flowering plants, but I'm going to include all of the plants, but I'm also include algae, and I'm going to include any non-animal microorganisms. So typically when we talk about soil flora, we are talking about bacteria and fungi and not actually plants at all. So the microflora of a soil are the bacteria and fungal that is growing there. So I'm going to go through these categories: macrofauna, macroflora, mesofauna, microfauna, microflora. I'm going to do all of the fauna first and then all of the flora. And I'm probably going to stop somewhere in the middle to take a break because it's a lot.